Dim streetlights flicker against the damp pavement as rain drizzles. A young black teen, Jalen 14 in a hoodie, walks alone, clutching his backpack. His breath is heavy, his eyes darting around nervously. Cop, Officer Reynolds, gruff, skeptical. Well, what do we have here? Out late, huh? Looking for trouble? Jalen freezes as red and blue lights flash. A tall, broad-shouldered white cop, Officer Reynolds, steps out of his cruiser, his hand resting near his holster. Jalen, swallowing hard, voice calm but firm. I'm just going home, sir. Reynolds scoffs, stepping closer, eyeing Jalen up and down. Officer Reynolds, mocking. Home? Dressed like that? With that attitude? What's in the bag, huh? Jalen grips his backpack tighter. His heartbeat pounds in his ears. His stomach knots as he glances at the body cam on Reynolds' chest, knowing it might be his only witness. Jalen, steadying himself. Just my school books. You can check if you want. Reynolds snorts, grabbing the bag roughly. Jalen doesn't resist, but his jaw tightens. He's been through this before. He knows how it ends. Officer Reynolds laughs coldly, shaking his head. You kids are all the same. Think you can fool me. You probably don't even have a father to come pick you up. Jalen's eyes flicker with something new, pain, anger, but also a quiet confidence. Then, calmly, he speaks a name that sends a shockwave through Reynolds' entire body. Jalen, slowly, clearly. My dad is Detective Carter. Your partner. The air changes. The rain seems to stop. Reynolds stiffens, his mocking smirk vanishing as his face goes pale. He blinks, unable to process what he just heard. The boy he just belittled is the son of the very man he trusts his life with. A mistake was just made, one that cannot be undone. Cut to black. The city hums with life, horns blaring, neon signs flickering against rain-slicked streets. In one part of town, towering office buildings symbolize progress. In another, cracked sidewalks and fading murals tell stories of resilience. It is a city where opportunity and struggle exist side by side, separated by unspoken lines. Jalen Carter, 14, walks into his school, his head held high despite the weight he carries. He's not just any kid. He's bright, ambitious, and carries the kind of quiet confidence that makes him stand out. His teachers describe him as driven, but the world often only sees what they want to see. Teacher, calling out as Jalen enters the classroom. Mr. Carter, early as usual. Jalen nods, dropping his backpack onto his desk, carefully pulling out his notebook. He sits in the front row as always. He likes to be where he can absorb everything. Gotta stay sharp, Ms. Reed. Can't let Malik beat me on this math test. Malik. Man, you got that. I ain't even trying to compete with the nerd king. Laughter ripples through the class, but it's friendly. Jalen takes the teasing in stride. He's not just book smart. He's got the kind of wisdom that comes, from understanding the world faster than most kids his age. But beneath that confidence, there's something else, a weight most kids don't carry. He's aware of how the world sees him. He's seen his mother's tired sighs when she reminds him to always be careful around authority. He remembers the last time a cop stopped him outside a convenience store, asking too many questions about why he was there. Jalen's father, Detective Marcus Carter, always told him to stay calm in those situations. Respect them, but don't let them walk all over you, his dad would say. Your last name carries weight, but your skin, that's the first thing they see. Those words stick with him. Bell rings. Jalen shoves his books back in his bag, fist bumps Malik, and heads outside. The school bus won't be coming. His dad was supposed to pick him up, but he's working late again. So, Jalen takes his usual route home, cutting through the quieter streets past the flickering lamplights toward a place where, unknown to him, a confrontation is waiting. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Officer Daniel Reynolds leans against his squad car, arms crossed, watching the street. He's been on the force for years, long enough to think he knows these streets and these kids. He prides himself on being tough, no nonsense. Old school policing is what he calls it. Reynolds isn't necessarily cruel, but he believes in stereotypes more than he'd ever admit. He's worked the same beat for years and thinks he can predict trouble just by looking at someone. To him, kids like Jalen, they're all the same. Defensive, rebellious, always looking for an angle. He doesn't see scholars, future leaders, or scared kids walking home. He sees suspects. Reynolds' partner, Detective Carter, is different. He's the only black detective in their division, and Reynolds respects him. He doesn't fully understand him, but he respects him. Marcus Carter works hard, never loses his temper, and demands respect without raising his voice. The two have had each other's backs in some dangerous situations, but if Reynolds had to admit it, he doesn't always get Carter's perspective. He thinks Carter is too soft sometimes, too careful about racial tension, too invested in proving that not all kids in rough neighborhoods are trouble. Tonight, Reynolds is patrolling alone. Carter is off duty. The streets are quiet, and Reynolds is on edge. Then he sees a figure walking in the distance. A lone black kid in a hoodie moving fast, looking around nervously. Reynolds' gut reaction? Suspicion. What do we have here? He flicks on his lights, rolls forward, and prepares to do what he does best, assert control. What he doesn't realize is that he's about to make a mistake that will shake him to his core. As Jalen walks, the police car slows beside him. He tenses. He's been through this before. He's polite, respectful, but inside, a familiar unease stirs. He thinks about his father's advice. Stay calm. Answer directly. Don't give them a reason. But why should he always have to be the one proving he's not a threat? Reynolds steps out, sizing Jalen up like he's already guilty of something. The rain drizzles around them, the street empty except for the hum of the idling police car. Reynolds, gruffly. Where you headed, kid? Jalen, home. A tense pause. Reynolds studies him. The weight of assumptions presses down. Jalen doesn't look like trouble, but in Reynolds' world, perception is often louder than truth. Reynolds, narrowing his eyes, arms crossed. That right? And with that, a chain of events begins, one that will force both of them to face hard truths about power, prejudice, and identity. But neither of them knows that yet. All they know is that a storm is coming, and neither of them. The street is eerily quiet except for the hum of Officer Reynolds' police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights cast distorted shadows against the wet pavement. Jalen stands still, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his heart pounding. He's been in situations like this before, but something about this moment feels different, more dangerous. Reynolds, arms crossed, voice sharp. You look nervous, kid. What are you up to? Jalen, calm, measured. I told you I'm walking home. Reynolds squints, stepping closer. To him, a hoodie, a backpack, and a wary expression are all red flags. He doesn't see a straight-A student, a detective's son. He sees a possible suspect, and suspects don't get the benefit of the doubt. Reynolds, gruffly, gesturing at the backpack. Mind if I take a look in there? Jalen hesitates. He knows his rights. He knows he doesn't have to say yes. But he also knows what happens when you say no. Jalen, steady but firm. I didn't do anything wrong. Reynolds' eyes narrow. In his mind, defiance equals guilt. His hand instinctively moves closer to his holster. Not what I asked, kid. Jalen clenches his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. The rain drips from his hood as he slowly, deliberately unzips his backpack and hands it over. Reynolds grabs it, rifling through the contents, math textbooks, a notebook, a half-eaten bag of chips. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, just the belongings of a kid who was telling the truth. But Reynolds isn't done. He isn't ready to admit he was wrong. Reynolds, mocking chuckle, shaking his head. What, no stolen goods, no little extras in here? Jalen exhales sharply, frustration bubbling beneath his composed exterior. Jalen, low, controlled anger. Can I go now? Reynolds, smirking, enjoying his authority over the situation. That depends, got ID on you? Jalen tightens his fists. This is the game. Keep pushing, keep probing, keep looking for a reason to escalate. He's seen this play out before. The wrong move, the wrong word, and it can spiral. Jalen, I'm 14, I don't carry ID. Reynolds clicks his tongue, shaking his head like Jalen's just confirmed a suspicion he already had. Jalen's patience wears thin. He's exhausted, tired of the same cycle, tired of being seen as a threat first and a person second. And then Reynolds crosses the line. No ID, out late walking alone. Let me guess. You don't even have a dad to come looking for you, huh? The words hit Jalen like a slap. For a split second, something flashes in his eyes. Hurt, rage, something deeper than Reynolds expected. And then, with an eerie calm, Jalen speaks. Jalen, measured, slow. My dad is Detective Marcus Carter, your partner. Silence. For the first time, Reynolds stiffens. The smirk vanishes. His face drains of color as the realization sinks in. Reynolds stares at Jalen, the words circling his mind like a warning siren. His partner's son. The boy he just treated like a suspect. The boy he just mocked. He opens his mouth, but no words come out. He suddenly feels the weight of the badge on his chest, once a symbol of authority, now a burning reminder of his failure. Reynolds, clearing his throat, forcing nonchalance. Listen, kid. I was just doing my job. Just making sure everything's in order. Jalen, cold, unimpressed. You already checked my bag. You already decided who I was before you even talked to me. Reynolds shifts uncomfortably, but Jalen isn't done. Jalen, firm, eyes locked on him. Would you have stopped me if I looked different? The question lands like a punch. Reynolds wants to deny it, wants to say this had nothing to do with race, that he would have treated any kid the same way. But deep down, in the part of himself he doesn't like to examine, he knows the truth. Before Reynolds can find an excuse, a car pulls up fast, headlights cutting through the rain. The door swings open, and Detective Marcus Carter steps out. He's still in his plain clothes, his badge flashing under the streetlight. His face is unreadable, but his movements are precise, controlled. He looks from Reynolds to Jalen, and he knows. What's going on here? Jalen doesn't speak, he doesn't need to. The tension between the three of them is suffocating. Reynolds steps back, suddenly feeling smaller. This is his partner. The man he's trusted in dangerous situations. The man who always had his back, and he just stopped his son like a common criminal. Carter, sharper now. What happened? Reynolds looks at Jalen. The boy's eyes are steady, unflinching. He's not scared anymore. He's watching, waiting to see if justice is just a word or something real. Carter turns to his son, his voice softer but still laced with quiet fury. Carter, you okay? Jalen nods, but his shoulders are tense. Carter sees it. He sees all of it. Reynolds swallows hard. His mind races. He could defend himself, argue that it was just a routine stop. But he knows Carter won't buy it. Not after everything. Not after years of hearing about this happening to other kids, just never expecting it would be his own. Reynolds, hesitant, regretful, but still defensive. Look, I didn't know. If I had known he was your... Carter, sharp, cutting him off. You think that should matter? Silence. A painful silence. One that stretches between them, full of everything unspoken. My son shouldn't have to be my son to get treated with respect. Reynolds exhales, realizing there's nothing he can say. No excuse will undo what just happened. No words can erase the damage. And for the first time in his life, he understands, really understands, what Carter has been saying all these years. Carter puts a hand on Jalen's shoulder, guiding him toward the car. Before they leave, Carter turns to Reynolds one last time, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that shakes him. I trusted you. The words land like a final verdict. And as Carter and Jalen drive away, Reynolds is left standing alone in the rain, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the truth he can't ignore anymore. The atmosphere inside the precinct is tense. The usual chatter of officers, the ringing phones, and the distant hum of police scanners feel muted, like the building itself senses the storm brewing within. Detective Marcus Carter strides through the halls, his expression unreadable. Jalen walks beside him, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. The weight of what just happened lingers between them. Inside one of the conference rooms, Officer Reynolds sits at the table, his hands clasped, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. He looks up as Carter and Jalen enter, but the usual ease, the camaraderie they once shared is gone. In its place, something raw, something broken. Chief Anderson, stern, addressing Reynolds. "You know why we're here." Reynolds swallows hard. He glances at Carter, but his partner, his former friend, doesn't meet his eyes. Reynolds, clearing his throat, defensive but uneasy. "Look, Chief, I made a mistake, all right? I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Reynolds." Carter, measured, voice tight with restrained fury. "You didn't know he was my son, so you assumed he was trouble. You assumed he was dangerous. You looked at him, and before he even spoke, you decided exactly who he was. A suspect." Reynolds shifts uncomfortably. The guilt is there, deep in his gut. But his pride, his years of experience, won't let him admit it fully. Not yet. "Come on, Carter. You know how it is. We're trained to look for signs, to recognize patterns." He fit a profile. Hoodie, backpack, out late. I was just being cautious. Jalen, his voice steady, but there's fire beneath it. "A profile?" Jalen takes a step closer, and for the first time, Reynolds feels small. The boy in front of him isn't just Carter's son. He's the face of every kid Reynolds has ever stopped for the same reason. Every person he's ever judged without real cause. What profile says a straight-A student walking home is a criminal? Reynolds looks away, jaw tightening. He doesn't have an answer for that. Not one that won't make him sound like exactly what he's afraid to admit he is. Carter steps forward now, his voice low but laced with a quiet, devastating power. "Reynolds, we've been partners for years. I trusted you with my life. But tell me, right now, tell me to my face, would you have stopped him if he was a white kid? In a polo shirt?" Reynolds stiffens. He wants to say yes. He wants to claim he would have treated anyone the same. But the truth sits like a stone in his throat. Because deep down, he knows. He knows. And the realization that Carter knows too, that Jalen sees, right through him, makes his stomach churn. "I didn't mean to, but you did." The silence that follows is suffocating. Reynolds' breath is shallow. His badge feels heavier than ever, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Carter, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "You didn't just stop my son, Reynolds. You stole something from him, something I can't get back." Reynolds' brow furrows. He doesn't understand. Not yet. Carter, his voice cracks slightly, the emotion rising now. His right to feel safe. Jalen swallows hard, his eyes burning with emotion he refuses to let spill over. Because it's true. The whole ride to the precinct. He sat in silence, staring out the window, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Like his entire existence was a threat in someone else's eyes. Reynolds didn't just pull him over, he made him feel small. And that's not something you can fix with an apology. Reynolds finally sees it. The impact, the wound he's inflicted. The realization hits him like a gut punch. And suddenly all the justifications, all the years of telling himself he was just doing his job feel like ashes in his mouth. Reynolds, quiet, shaken, almost to himself. "I never thought I was like that." No one ever does. Reynolds lets out a slow breath, his hands pressing against the table like it's the only thing keeping him grounded. His entire career, his entire identity, has been built on the idea that he was one of the good ones. But right now, looking at Carter, looking at Jalen, he isn't sure what that even means anymore. The room is heavy with silence. "Chief." Anderson watches, measuring Reynolds carefully. Then, after a long pause, he speaks. "Officer Reynolds, As of this moment, you are placed on administrative leave pending review of your conduct. Reynolds exhales sharply, nodding. He doesn't fight it, because for the first time in his career he isn't sure he deserves to wear that badge. Carter doesn't gloat, Jalen doesn't smirk, because this isn't about revenge, this is about justice, about accountability, about change. Outside the precinct, Jalen and Carter walk toward their car. The night air is crisp, carrying the weight of everything left unspoken. Jalen stops, his voice quieter now. Jalen, do you think he meant it? Carter, soft sigh, looking at his son with quiet pride. I think he's starting to. Jalen nods, but there's still something heavy in his chest. A wound that won't heal overnight. Carter sees it, feels it, and for the first time in years, he feels a fear he can't shake. The fear that no matter how hard he tries, he can't protect his son from the world. Carter, voice thick, a promise only a father can make. I know I can't fix what happened tonight, but I swear to you I will never stop fighting to make sure it doesn't happen again. Jalen meets his father's eyes, and for the first time tonight, he lets himself believe it. The car doors close, the engine hums to life, and as they drive into the night, there's no forgetting what happened, but there's also no running from it. Because the fight isn't over, not yet. A week has passed since the night at the precinct. The tension that once simmered between Carter and Reynolds has settled into something else, an uncomfortable quiet, a space filled with unspoken truths. But silence won't fix what's broken. And Carter knows that if anything is going to change, it has to start now. The two men sit across from each other in the break room, the dim fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Outside, officers move through their routines, but in here, the world has shrunk to just them. Carter, calm but firm. I need to know. Reynolds, what are you going to do about this? Reynolds looks up, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The last few days have been a reckoning, a forced confrontation with the kind of man he's been versus the kind of man he thought he was. But now, the weight in Carter's voice tells him that reflection isn't enough. Words aren't enough. Reynolds, slow, choosing his words carefully. I don't know where to start. Carter, leaning in, eyes locked on him. Then start by listening. Reynolds exhales, nodding. He hesitates, but for the first time in years, he's ready to listen. Later that evening, Jalen is in his room scrolling through social media, still feeling the weight of everything that's happened. His mind replays the moment over and over, Reynolds' hand gripping his shoulder, the coldness in his voice, the way his pulse had raced in fear. But then he hears a knock at the door. His father steps in, but he isn't alone. Reynolds stands behind him, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. Jalen sits up straighter, his body tensing. He doesn't want to hear another excuse. He doesn't want another forced apology. Carter, gently to Jalen. He asked to come. Jalen looks at Reynolds, waiting. Reynolds, quiet but sincere. I can't undo what I did, Jalen. And I won't insult you by saying I didn't mean it, because the truth is, what I meant doesn't matter. What I did matters. Jalen crosses his arms, his gaze unyielding. Jalen, measured, careful. So, why are you here? Reynolds, exhales, nods to himself, then speaks. Because I want to do better, and I need to start by learning. Jalen studies him for a long moment, his father's presence grounding him. He doesn't trust Reynolds, not yet. But there's something in the way the man stands, in the way his voice wavers, that makes Jalen pause. Because this isn't just a cop coming to smooth things over. This is a man unraveling the damage he's done. Jalen doesn't forgive him. Not now. Maybe not ever. But he does something just as powerful. He nods. Over the next few weeks, Reynolds takes action. Not because he has to, but because he chooses to. He enrolls in community bias training, sitting in a room full of people discussing the reality of racial profiling, listening, truly listening, to their experiences. He starts working with a youth outreach program, meeting kids who look like Jalen, kids who have stories just like his and hearing what it's like to live in a world that sees them as threats before it sees them as human. He speaks to other officers, challenging old mindsets, confronting the biases woven into the very fabric of their department. Not everyone is open to change, but some are. And that's enough to start something real. One night, Carter watches from the doorway as Jalen sees an article on his phone, one showing Reynolds at a community event speaking on what happened. The headline doesn't say Hero Cop Reforms. It says, Officer Confronts His Bias. I had to unlearn everything. Jalen doesn't say anything, but Carter catches the small nod of approval before his son locks his phone. It's a start. Months later, a town hall meeting is held at a local community center, where leaders, activists, and law enforcement gather to discuss new policing policies. Carter is there. So is Jalen. And so is Reynolds, sitting beside them. The moderator gestures to Reynolds, who shifts in his seat before speaking. Reynolds, into the mic, steady but raw. 6 months ago, I thought I was one of the good guys. I thought I didn't have bias, that I treated everyone the same. But that night with Jalen, it forced me to see that I was lying to myself. The room is silent, people watching with wary eyes, waiting to hear why he's here. I didn't come here to be applauded. I came because I have work to do. We all do. And I'll spend every day proving that I can do better, not with words, but with actions. The crowd doesn't clap. There are no cheers. But there are nods, a few murmurs of agreement, and that's enough, because change doesn't start with applause, it starts with accountability. As the meeting ends, Jalen walks beside his father, still processing everything. He turns to Carter, a question lingering in his expression. Do you think he'll stick with it, or is this just for show? Carter watches Reynolds shake hands with a community leader, the sincerity evident in his posture. He doesn't smile, doesn't gloat. He just observes. Carter, after a pause, then softly, I think he knows now that change isn't about proving something to others. It's about proving it to yourself, and I think for the first time in his life, he's finally ready to do that. Jalen doesn't say anything right away, but after a moment he nods. And as they walk out into the cool night air, there's something new lingering between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but hope. The scene fades to Carter sitting alone at his desk, flipping through an old photo of him and Reynolds. Back, when things were simpler, he sets it down, exhaling slowly. His phone buzzes, a text from Jalen. I don't know if I'll ever trust him, but I hope he proves me wrong. Carter smiles, just a little. Because that's enough for now. This section reinforces the idea that real change takes work. Reynolds doesn't get instant forgiveness. He doesn't become a hero overnight. Instead, he does the hard thing. He listens, he learns, and he acts. The resolution also highlights Carter's quiet hope and Jalen's cautious willingness to see if people can truly change. The themes of accountability, justice, and growth remain at the forefront, ensuring that this isn't just a story about one cop learning a lesson, it's a story about what comes next. As the story of Officer Reynolds, Carter, and Jalen comes to a close, the real conversation begins. The events that unfolded between them are not isolated incidents. They mirror the experiences of countless individuals in communities across the country. This story is not just about one officer's bias or one young black man's fear. It's about a deeply rooted systemic issue that has existed for generations. The reality of racial bias in law enforcement studies show that black individuals, especially young black men, are disproportionately stopped, questioned, and detained by law enforcement. According to research from the Sentencing Project, Black Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. The NAACP reports that despite making up only 13% of the U.S. population, Black individuals account for nearly 40% of those incarcerated. But these aren't just statistics, these are real lives impacted every single day. Jalen's experience, though fictional, reflects the reality of many young black men who find themselves facing judgment, suspicion, or even danger for simply existing. The tragic stories of Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and Elijah McClain serve as stark reminders of what happens when biases, both implicit and explicit, go unchecked. In many of these cases, law enforcement officers or authority figures reacted based on fear, assumption, or systemic conditioning, rather than fact or fairness. Jalen's story could have ended like so many others, with a headline, a protest, and a grieving family. But what if we didn't wait for tragedy to spark action? What if we addressed these biases before they turned fatal? The role of implicit bias and unconscious racism. Officer Reynolds wasn't a bad cop in the traditional sense. He wasn't overtly hateful or intentionally targeting black individuals. But that's the danger of implicit bias. It operates beneath the surface, shaping decisions in ways people don't always recognize. Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, a social psychologist at Stanford University, has conducted extensive research on implicit bias and how it influences decision-making. She found that people, including law enforcement officers, are more likely to associate black faces with crime, even when they don't consciously believe they are racist. This unconscious bias manifests in ways that seem small at first. A police officer gripping his holster when a black teen walks by. A store clerk keeping a closer eye on a black customer. A hiring manager overlooking a resume because of an ethnic-sounding name. These biases may not always lead to direct harm, but over time, they create a culture of fear, suspicion, and inequality. Jalen was not seen as a boy walking home, he was seen as a potential threat. And that perception alone could have changed his life forever. So, what can be done? Steps toward systemic change. To address these deep-seated issues, there must be efforts at both the individual and institutional levels. The conversation around police reform is not about vilifying law enforcement, but about ensuring accountability and fairness. Some steps that can make a real impact include mandatory implicit bias training. Like the one Reynolds eventually attended, ongoing education can help officers recognize and counteract their biases before they affect their actions. Community-based policing. Encouraging officers to engage with the communities they serve can humanize their interactions with residents and reduce unnecessary confrontations. Body cameras and policy reform. Transparency and oversight are crucial. Policies should ensure that misconduct is met with real consequences. Law enforcement is only one part of the issue. Society as a whole needs to reassess how black individuals, especially young men, are viewed and treated. Media representation matters. News outlets often portray black individuals in criminal contexts more frequently than their white counterparts. Hollywood has historically reinforced stereotypes of black men as dangerous or threatening. Changing the narrative starts with changing representation, educating the next generation. Schools should incorporate lessons about race, bias, and systemic injustice into their curriculums. Ignoring history only allows it to repeat itself. Personal responsibility. People must be willing to unlearn biases they've absorbed over the years. This means having uncomfortable conversations, questioning assumptions, and actively working to see people as individuals, not stereotypes. Systemic change happens when communities take control of their narratives and demand better. Some ways this is already happening include local activism. Groups like Black Lives Matter and the NAACP continue to push for policy changes that protect marginalized communities. Community watch programs, not ones rooted in fear or suspicion, but ones designed to support and uplift rather than police and punish. Youth mentorship programs. One of the biggest themes in this story is whether individuals, especially those with deep-seated biases, can actually change. Carter, Jalen's father, knows firsthand that real transformation is rare but possible. He has spent years watching officers like Reynolds, some who never change and others who only change when they are forced to. But Reynolds chooses to change. And that choice, though difficult, is the first step toward something real. The real test isn't whether Reynolds made a mistake. It's what he does afterward that defines him. Does he learn? Does he act? Does he hold himself accountable? And the same question applies to society. Do we learn? Do we act? Do we hold ourselves accountable? Change doesn't come from words alone, it comes from action. This isn't just a story, it's a conversation starter. A challenge, a reminder. The next time you see a headline about police misconduct or racial profiling, don't just scroll past it. Ask yourself, what biases do I hold? How do I respond when I see injustice? What role do I play in creating a more just society? And if you're in a position of power, whether in law enforcement, education, media, or leadership, use it responsibly. Jalen, Carter, and Reynolds are fictional, but their story is very, very real. As the story of Jalen, Carter, and Reynolds draws to a close, we're left with more than just a narrative. We're left with a challenge. A question that demands our attention, our reflection, and most importantly, our action. This isn't just the tale of one police officer trying to right a wrong, or a father and son navigating a fractured relationship. It's the story of a society in conflict, one that is grappling with deep-seated divisions, long-standing biases, and a yearning for change. But change doesn't come easily. It demands that we look inside ourselves, confront uncomfortable truths, and choose to act differently. Will we choose to be better? The weight of the question is heavy, but it's also necessary, because the truth is, Jalen's story, though fictionalized here, reflects the real experiences of millions of young black men and women who face similar challenges every day. It's not just a story, it's their reality. And that's why we cannot ignore it. We cannot look away and say, that's someone else's problem, bro. No, this is all of us. The world that Jalen lives in, the world that Reynolds came to understand, it's a world we all share, and it's up to us to change it. What can you do? Start by educating yourself. Understand the complexities of racial inequality and bias. It's easy to think that the problems we see on the surface are the whole story, but we know it goes deeper. Research, listen, and learn about the history of racism, both in your own country and around the world. Engage in meaningful conversations. Talk to the people around you. Don't shy away from tough discussions about race, bias, and justice. If we all stay silent, nothing changes. But when we speak up, when we listen and engage, it sparks something bigger. Support organizations that are making a difference. Find nonprofits and community groups working to address racial injustice, whether they focus on police reform, education, or racial equity. Your donation, your time, your voice, they all matter. Demand change. Whether it's by voting, advocating for policy change, or supporting leaders who are committed to fairness and equality, you have the power to influence the future. Every small action, every small step can make a difference. But perhaps the most powerful thing we can do, the thing that each of us has the ability to do right now, is to examine our own biases. We all have them, and that's okay. What matters is what we do once we recognize them. Will we allow them to define our actions? Or will we choose to confront them, learn from them, and become better people for it? As Carter said in the story, real change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with one person. One choice, one act of courage. And that courage doesn't always look like a grand gesture. It might look like listening to someone's story. It might look like standing up in the face of injustice even when it's uncomfortable. It might look like simply choosing to be kind in a world that is often harsh. Hope for tomorrow. The truth is change takes time. It's slow, sometimes painful, and often uncomfortable. But it is possible. Just like Reynolds, people can learn. People can grow. They can choose to act with compassion, understanding, and empathy, even when it's hard. And this is the hope that we can carry forward. That even though we may face resistance, setbacks, and frustration, we have the power to make this world a better place. The future is in our hands, and it's never too late to start. So, I ask you, what are you going to do? What actions will you take to ensure that a story like Jalen's doesn't repeat itself tomorrow? How will you challenge the biases in yourself and in the world around you? Because the truth is, the change starts with you. If you believe in equality, in justice, in a future where every person is seen for who they are, not the color of their skin, then this is your call to action. It's time to stand up. It's time to speak out. and it's time to make the world we live in one that reflects the values we all deserve. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Talk to your friends and family. Stand for what is right. Because when we stand together, we are stronger. And when we fight for justice, we win.